Do you know Shelby Starnes?
Yeah. I haven't read much of his stuff. I'm familiar with him.
Yeah, I mean, I used to read his stuff years and years ago, but I remember talking to him a little bit, and there was one guy on a forum who was saying he thinks that when you bulk up and you gain muscle, you've got to hold on to it for a while before you diet down. And Shelby Starnes said he didn't believe that. He thinks, muscle growth is muscle growth, and that as soon as it's there, it's good. But he later changed his mind. I remember talking to him like 2 years later, and he said, actually, since then, I think you should hold on to it. And I think maybe the mechanisms you're talking about might be a reason for that. That maybe, if you're at the peak of your bulk and those last 5 pounds have been mostly from sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, maybe you do need to hold on to it for a few months before you cut down. And it's hard to say in my own experience, just being one person, but I think it does kind of make sense to hold on to it. Some people talk about like solidifying the gains before cutting down. Maybe that's a potential mechanism by which that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that feeds into the phase sequencing comment that I was making. I think that there is rationale physiologically for continuing to present a stimulus that encourages the retention of myofibrils,
Yeah.
like actual myofibrillar protein. And there's probably a lower bound threshold of intensity of load that corresponds to a more effective retention of it. That was really overly complicated way of saying that. Yeah, I think that what you're saying makes sense, and um, solidifying your gains, stabilizing a period of, and there's some cool rodent data, man, that from Ogasawara that suggests that mTOR signaling, and this is in rats. I said that already, right?
Yeah.
So basically, the mTOR pathway, which is sort of a convergence point or a central hub of anabolic signaling in muscle cells, that eventually results in increased muscle protein synthesis. That is, if mTOR signaling and activity increases, we'll tend to see an eventual increase in muscle protein synthesis. If mTOR signaling is going on, that makes sense, right? It's quote unquote anabolism.
Right.
That pathway can become somewhat desensitized, and you don't see similar levels of activation with a continued presentation of the same stimulus. With a period of deloading, or a removal of the training stimulus, or at least a reduction in it, you can see a restoration of mTOR signaling. So in other words, you become desensitized, then through a period of either an adjustment in the training stimulus, for example, maybe emphasizing metabolite accumulation, or simply just deloading, you could restore typical anabolic signaling. But if you extrapolate that to the human, I think that I've found that after about probably 3 months, maybe as many as 6, you can be pretty consistent with a certain training design, at least the qualitative design.
Yeah.
And this depends on the level of training. Someone that's more advanced would probably warrant a different approach. But let's just say 3 to 6 months of tension emphasis work. But after that, I think it's a good idea to adjust the emphasis of the training to resensitize some of that signaling. I would argue, and my approach is more on the order of every 2 or 3 months.
Yeah.
I like to adjust the emphasis. For example, for someone who's interested in maximizing muscle growth, I'll commonly use a combination of low and high reps, and we'll overload through the addition of both load and set volume. So we'll increase both the sets and the load per set, while the reps hang out in similar ranges. And then after a period of 2 or 3 months, I'll shift into a strength block, is what I'll refer to it as, where the emphasis is more strength and the volume is lower. And I think that resensitizes a lot of that hypertrophic signaling that can help solidify those gains. And we'll structure the diet in that period as more of a maintenance period where we stabilize body weight,
Yeah.
and stabilize body composition. And then move into, it depends on the person, but then we'll move into a different sort of macro cycle.
Right.
But yeah, a combination of both light and heavy loads, because we know that, well, it's debated now if metabolite accumulation and metabolic stress are that important.
Right.
Obviously, tension is the, I think, key. But that's a fancy way of saying the contraction of those fibers and the experience of the fibers experiencing tension through the production of it, or passively experiencing it through stretching under load, i.e., the eccentric portion of the movement. That's the key signal, but that causes the generation of metabolites. So they're not exclusive pathways, right? There's some redundancy there. But I think that if we could block metabolite accumulation and only emphasize tension alone, that would reduce the hypertrophic response that we would see. Now, by comparison to tension, probably not nearly as much, but I do think that it adds to. In other words, it's a contributory cause of hypertrophy. Maybe not necessary or sufficient, but I think that it's a contributory cause, sort of like hypertrophy for strength. But that's a different conversation.